Welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast, hosted by Dave Jenkins. The Equipping You in Grace podcast is a podcast about helping Christians develop a biblical worldview in a conversational tone about issues inside and outside the church. Now, for today's episode, let's join our host, Dave Jenkins.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Equip You in Grace podcast. My name is Dave, and I'm the host for this show. And with us today is our friend and sister in Christ, Megan. Megan, welcome to your first time to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I'm really excited about it. My wife and I really appreciate your work as a journalist, and thankful for that we get to talk about this new book that we're going to get into today. Can you just tell us about your life, marriage, your work as a journalist, and what projects you're currently working on?
Sure. Well, I mean, mostly what I'm working on right now is what we're doing at this very second, which is a lot of interviews and just discussions and speeches surrounding the topic of this book. But when I'm not doing that, which is most of the time, my husband and I live in North Carolina, and we have two daughters, 10 and just recently turned 15. So which is, it has been surprisingly an easy transition into the teenage years. We're really blessed. And so far, none of the terrible stories that I've heard. And if you're not familiar with my husband, people are always a little fascinated to find out that he's Megan Basham of World Magazine's World Watch. So a lot of homeschoolers get that program. And so that is my husband. So we both kind of work in Christian media. Of course, I'm now working in conservative secular media, but I came up in Christian media. So I'm very familiar with that world. And so I work from home, and that's really nice. I'm able to do my writing and investigative reporting and all of that stuff largely from my kitchen with a laptop in one hand on the kitchen table and phone in the other. And so it's great. I love having that flexibility.
That's a deadly combination right there.
Right?
Kitchen table, laptop, phone, and hopefully no knives around, although
right.
I know that you sharpen that knife it's pretty sharp. So,
Right.
Well, can you tell us about this new book, Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda, why you wrote it, and how you hope it'll be received?
Yeah. So I think I started writing it really without realizing I was writing it. Around 2019, 2020, like a lot of other Christians in America, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable in the church. And it just sounded at that point kind of quiet alarm bells. I went, gosh, I don't know that I agree with that. I don't know that that sounds terribly biblical. And at that time, it was mostly coming out of the conversation surrounding racial reconciliation, which seemed to have morphed from reconciling to this very sort of divisive grievance peddling. And I didn't even know what the word CRT, that acronym, would have meant at that time, like most people. I just knew that I was hearing things that biblically sounded off to me. And then, of course, as 2019 went into the year of our Lord, 2020, when it felt like all the wheels came off the wagon, we saw so many things in regards to how the church handled COVID, and at the same time with the George Floyd riots and the Black Lives Matter movement. And just so many things that were disquieting were suddenly thrown into sharp relief, where you felt like, oh, we have a problem here in the church. And so I started writing about those issues at Daily Wire. And for the first time in really my entire adult career, I was working for a conservative but secular media company. And it was almost like for the first time I was standing outside of the evangelical public world and writing about it from the outside, though as an evangelical. And it gave me a freedom I maybe didn't have before to be a little more bold and blunt than I could when I was writing from inside the house. And so it just started on its own. I was almost like I couldn't not write about it because these things were on my heart. They bothered me. As I started doing the research, it bothered me more. And as the articles were coming out, people were responding so strongly. And then an editor approached me and said, I really think this should be a book. So, people have asked me, well, what was your plan? And I really didn't have one. It was all extremely providential. I didn't have really a plan to go to the Daily Wire. I didn't have a plan to start writing about these issues, and I didn't have a plan to write a book about it. It all just kind of unfolded in God's plan.
That makes sense. That those are usually the best books, though, because you end up just writing about it. It just ends up coming out, and I'm sure it doesn't come out like when I write. It's all like, it's not a jumbled mess when I write, but it's all like, my wife calls it word salad.
Right.
I call it vomit on a page, and then I organize it and make it all pretty and nice and all that. But I'm sure you didn't do that, but.
I did a lot. You start that way, right?
Yeah,
and then you go in and you shape it. You just kind of get all the ideas and all the bits of information down on the page. And then you go in and go, gosh, I have to organize this.
Yeah, this is a, it's an important book. We won't get into all of everything, in this book, but it's a needed work that you have given, and I know we're going to get into quite a few of the people and the names and some of the details without giving away the whole house of the book, so people do pick up the book. But your book, you share personal stories of individuals who have felt confused and dismayed by the shift in the teachings within evangelical churches. So based on your research, even your observations, what challenges and opportunities do you see for Christian communities amid the rapid cultural shift?
Well, probably the biggest challenge is going to be how we navigate this in terms of, and this has been a popular taxonomy, so I will use Aaron Renn's taxonomy as well, because I think it does do a good job describing the evolution of American culture, in the sense that, only a few decades ago, being a Christian was a positive thing in our culture. We lived in a society that respected that. And even if, most people were themselves not saved, they at least thought in positive terms about people who were. And it enhanced your public reputation to say, I am a Christian. And then we kind of went through this period, and Renn puts it to, I think, '90s to pre-Obergefell, where it was really neutral. America wasn't really a Christian culture anymore, but it wasn't necessarily hostile to Christianity. And then post-Obergefell, we have entered that negative period where we see a lot of hostility coming at the church. And I think the challenges within the church have been, how do we adapt to this hostile culture? And part of the way that we have adapted is to try to lose our distinctiveness so as not to be offensive. And I think we've seen that all over the place. So in my book, there are two things happening. I think there are compromises in order to not stand out and not be biblically distinctive so that we are not offensive to our neighbors. But then you also see a lot of secular left powerful actors recognizing that to the degree that we want to secularize and de-Christianize this nation even further, these people are standing in our way. So how do we get around them? And, I would say around 2000 to 2013 is when you saw some of these secular actors say, well, the best way to do this would be to stop just directly opposing Christian churches, and it would be better to try to co-opt them and come into the church and rechristen our secular left priorities with kind of churchy language and repackage them for the church and say, hey, you want to get on board with this too. So you saw environmentalism, climate change, issues like that being repackaged as creation care, or you would see things like the LGBTQ movement being repackaged. Instead of sin, it's now brokenness. And so all of this sort of language manipulation. And I would say those are the big challenges that we have. Now, on the positive side, to quickly sum up the second part of your question, I would say that to me, the positive is that there's been an extreme pushback, I think, since COVID. In a weird way, I have come to view COVID as a blessing, because I think it revealed so much to us about the state of the church and what problems we have and what needs to be addressed. And I think since 2020, we have had a real conversation among Christians that we weren't having before because it just felt uncomfortable or maybe not very nice. And suddenly we realized, no, we can't keep ignoring these issues.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple times already about the matter of, even we call it contextualization, and this whole idea of contextualization. It's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, in so far as like when you're doing missions and evangelism, understanding the people groups. But people have co-opted, to use your word, co-opted. They've used that idea, and instead of using that to reach a people group and understanding them and being faithful to the word with all those necessary qualifications, like you're talking about, instead what we've done is we've used that, and instead of being a distinct and holy people unto God, we have, we've allowed, like you mentioned, gender, sexuality. We've allowed the New Age and so much more to come in and to infiltrate the health and the well-being of the church. You mentioned racial reconciliation. I remember putting this in the back of my head coming out of seminary. I think it was 2012 when this whole idea of racial reconciliation, came out, and I was like, hey, I'm gonna pencil that in the back of my head. I'm gonna hold this in the back of my head and pay attention to how that plays out. And sure enough, it played out, and I was like, okay. So, but I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna see see the fruit of that. And what we're seeing, just to the point about that you're bringing out, is we've started to see the fruit of all of this bad theology that actually goes back really a long time in the evangelical world. But it started with this whole idea of, just contextualize the gospel. We saw that with, the seeker-sensitive movement. We see that with the emerging church. We see that with the quote-unquote, air quotes, progressive Christianity, which J. Garrison Machen over 100 years ago said is no Christianity at all. And I mean, you could go on and on and on. So, but yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of compromise, but it all goes back to that idea of contextualization, not being faithfully reaching people, but compromising both the message and our witness.
Yeah, and I think that we can also see in so many ways how that's created division in the church. And that was part of why I told so many stories, because I tried to balance out, okay, here are the sort of high level concepts. So when we talk about something like critical race theory, I mean, I was one of the people who, when I first heard it in 2019, I've never heard of that. What does that mean? So then you try to get your mind around it. But then I was wanting to tell the stories to make people understand this is how it's manifesting itself in the church. For example, at a church here in my hometown here in Charlotte, North Carolina, where it was a PCA church, and you had a Be the Bridge Bible study where white church members were being told, you are not to talk for the first 6 months of this Bible study. You are just to sit and listen. I mean, that's incredibly divisive. This same church started racially segregated groups within the church to say, these Bible studies are only going to be for our minority church members so that they can have a safe space to lament, or I can't remember the exact verbiage, but the point was they were separating, to use the biblical symbolism, the Jew and the Greek. They were saying, we're going to keep these racial groups apart within the church. And that was so opposed to scripture. And yet this was supposedly being done in the name of reconciliation. And you can see how there's nothing reconciling about that. And I spoke to women in some of these ministries who, I mean, just really seemed like whipped puppies to me, because they believed it and they wanted to follow their church's directives, and they wanted to be faithful in attending their Bible studies, and they wanted to do the work, so to speak. And instead they were being abused. And so that was part of why it was really important to both do the high level explanation of what these ideologies are, while also showing here's how it's impacting people in the pews.
Yeah, that's good, Megan. You mentioned some of the people trying to infiltrate the church. We know one of those people is George Soros, among other people, and he's been, buying the influence of evangelicals in the hopes that their views will trickle down to the rank and file and transform their behavior. Can you speak to that a little bit for our audience?
Yeah, and it's funny because when you say George Soros, I go to that one a lot in interviews because everybody knows who George Soros is, and I don't have to explain George Soros's background. But he's far from being the only one. Another secular left billionaire that is involved in a lot of this, attempt to infiltrate churches through various organizations that are partnering with ministries is a guy named Pierre Omidyar, who is the Buddhist founder of eBay. And so you will see groups like this that are these foundations that are founded and funded by secular left billionaires. They want to get certain legislation across the finish line. In George Soros's case, a lot of different legislation, but one I spend a lot of time on in the book is he wants particular immigration policies in place. And so there is a secular group that he funds called the National Immigration Forum. It's leans left, it is secular. And what they did was they created an evangelical front group called the Evangelical Immigration Table. And when you hear that, people might tend to think, oh, well, so they're ministering to immigrants who are arriving here, or they're spreading the gospel to immigrants. And I always want to stress very strongly that no, that is not what they do, and that is not their purpose. Their purpose is very explicitly political to get certain legislation passed. So it was launched around 2013, around the time of the Gang of Eight bill, if you will remember. That was put forward by Chuck Schumer and John McCain. And so George Soros created a program. He funded a program within this Evangelical Immigration Table. It was a part of this program called Bibles, Badges, and Business. And its purpose was to influence traditionally conservative constituencies like businesses and law enforcement and Christians. And so those are the kind of projects that guys like George Soros have been funding. And there were other secular left funders of this initiative as well. And they very explicitly tried to get the Gang of Eight bill passed, failed at that, but you will see them still at work today. And they partner with lots of well-known evangelical ministries that you know and have heard of, like the National Association of Evangelicals, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, which represents 185 Christian schools, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. So these are the groups that are partnering with these secular left-funded, what I would call AstroTurf campaigns and front groups. And that's their purpose, is essentially they just want to see their preferred policies passed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sad. You know, I have written for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. I have had friends that have worked there, people that everybody would know. They'd go on the news, and unfortunately, I've had to disconnect I'll just say it this way without naming names. I've had to disconnect myself and distance myself, especially in light of some of the comments that have come out of that. And I've never ever mentioned. This is the first time I've ever mentioned anything like that in any kind of setting, especially publicly. But it's so concerning, because when you start to see what has come out and what is things that have been said from the ERLC, TGC, some of the things that you mentioned, I'm just like, what are you even saying anymore? Like, I don't even know what you mean. I'm just gonna go over here in my corner, and and just do my own thing, and just stop. I've actually just stopped pretty much writing for any other place at this point, because it's just like so questionable anymore. Like, after, especially, in light of COVID. I mean, COVID is, like you mentioned, COVID revealed, I think the best way to say it is COVID revealed a lot, but I think it was already there underneath the surface. And so everybody just had more time to take a look at it, take a look under the hood at things, and the things that people were saying, they've been saying it for a while. People just weren't paying attention.
Yeah. And I think, in COVID, when suddenly something like, to love your neighbor and follow Jesus was applied to something like, you must get this experimental vaccine, which we could have a debate on whether the vaccine was good or bad or helpful or not helpful. And I never took a hardline position on that. The issue to me was saying, okay, something that should certainly be a matter of personal conscience, that is left up to to individual liberty, to say that, no, you must do this to follow Jesus, was such legalism. Like, it would have been harder to come up with an example of legalism that was so paralleled something like you must eat this food or not eat this food to show that you're following Jesus. At that moment, that's when I went, okay, I'm not crazy. What I think I'm seeing, I am definitely seeing it, because that one was just kind of so egregious.
Yeah, when you have quote unquote friends that you've known for a long time, you know them not just like online, but you know them personally. Like you text them, you call them, you've invested in them, and you see them writing in newspapers all across the country and on media platforms that everybody would know, and making the kind of statements that these people made. I'm just like, I don't even know who you are anymore. And we're talking about supporting COVID and making exactly the same kind of arguments that you're making. And churches, I think what our church here did was we had one service for those who wanted to have a mask and one service that didn't. And I was okay. I think, like you're saying, it's a conscious issue, and just leave it at that, But telling Christians that they have to get a vaccine or whatever, and that's a whole nother conversation, another rabbit trail for another day. But we already know what it was, what ended up happening with that, and the evidence even against the vaccine is evident, and it's out there. And so but
and the reason why they did it, I mean, that is really what connects it to all these other issues, is that the reason it was done is because our culturally powerful institutions and individuals were telling us that we needed to get in line with that. And so you saw the church getting in line with those narratives of the powerful. And I would say that you have seen the same thing on issues like climate change, or when it comes to the LGBTQ movement, it hasn't necessarily, which I always have to say it that way for work, so now it just comes out like, but when you look at how we talk about those issues, even if a church didn't directly capitulate and say, okay, we're changing our stance and our doctrine on sexuality and marriage, what they did do was soften their stance in such a way as to not talk about the issue or to treat it very differently than other sins. Like, we would never say, we need to figure out how to be more hospitable to people who have a predilection for lying. We don't do that. We say, that's a sin. You need to repent of that. Don't do that. But we were not doing that for these issues of same-sex attraction. We were saying this is a special category of sin that needs to come with its own kind of cloaking language. Like, instead of saying, okay, this is homosexuality, the behaviors, the identities, that is sin, repent from it, it became, that's a brokenness. That is some kind of an issue where we need to have an especially soft heart for that particular sin. Well, we want to have a soft heart for all sinners, but it was just being put in a special category with its own special descriptors, like pronoun hospitality or things of that nature, where you just went, we would never do that with any other category of sin. So that to me was the through line, is that these positions are being taken because they are unpopular, because the biblical position is unpopular in our culture. Therefore, we have to try to find a way to sort of mask where we stand.
100%. That's really good. Can you please speak about evangelical leaders like Rick Warren and Russell Moore, who I'll just preface this by saying I used to have a lot of respect for Russell Moore, and now I don't. For a lot of reasons. He promotes the Enneagram, which is totally godless, anti-godly, and that's just the tip of the iceberg there. But just who these two men, so Rick Warren and Russell Moore, who have potential conflicts with traditional biblical values.
Well, and you could look at a lot of different issues that sort of exemplify that. With Rick Warren, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about how he softened his language, for example, on homosexuality, to the point where I recount an interview he gave just a couple of years ago with a British media outlet, where this interviewer, and she did a great job. She really would not let him sort of wriggle out of answering the question, but she was trying to ask him, one, is homosexuality a sin? And then if so, if part of your church wants to say that it's not, is that a justifiable reason for splitting? And he really tried very hard to not answer that question. And part of what I traced in that chapter was how these affirming, to use the language of the left, this gay affirming, transgender affirming curriculum was brought into Saddleback. And when I asked Saddleback about it, there was no acknowledgement that it was happening. There was no repentance over the fact that that had happened. There was simply, we're just going to take down the websites that reference it and never talk about it, the web pages that reference it, and just pretend like it didn't happen. So to the point that I am told that these groups are still ongoing, you just can't find them publicly listed on Saddleback's web pages anymore. And I think a big part of why that happened with Rick Warren, for example, was because he became so revered in the wider culture that he's been traveling in similar circles, by his own admission, at the World Economic Forum, welcome to Davos, with the Council of Foreign Relations. And I think that that one can turn people's head when you have those kind of powerful associations. I think there is an instinct to not want to lose them. And we very much kind of have seen the same evolution with Russell Moore, where he's been elevated in secular media and in fellowships and foundations that have very much drifted to the left, like Trinity Forum. And that has changed his position on how he speaks about certain issues and the public positions that he stakes. And like, if you talk to Russell Moore today about issues like women in the pastorate, the Bible is very clear on that. And suddenly, where he once was clear, he is not clear anymore. And he has, kind of said, oh, I need to retract. I went too far. You've seen the same thing with his friend Beth Moore on homosexuality, pulling passages that were once very clear in addressing homosexuality as sin, pulling that out of her old books and reprints, not wanting that material in there anymore. And when you look at Russell Moore, he's a little clearer than Rick Warren in being very connected to these secular foundations. Like, he is extremely involved in the Evangelical Immigration Table, which is funded by these secular left foundations. And I try very hard not to say in the book, okay, here's what I think the motivations are, where it's not clear. I mean, where it's clear, I feel pretty comfortable. If I have a email record, or, it's pretty obvious that you can track a series of events, that's okay. But if I don't know, I try not to say. But what I can show you is, here's what the secular left foundations and grant makers were saying in their memos and in their own material, where they are saying, we are going to try to gain access to the Southern Baptist Convention by harnessing the power of its high-profile influencers. And you can see that in George Soros' own material, it names Russell Moore as a grantee. Not very clear why, but we know that that's there. So we know that there's a deep involvement with those kind of groups. And I think that it is not a stretch to say that obviously has influenced his public positions.
Yeah, I've been concerned about that for a while, and I just watched as my friends went over to the ELRLC and they started to change. And I mean, these were very conservative. Some of them were even pastors or whatever. This is around the time when he took over at the ELRC. And I knew these people before they came, and I just sat and I watched, and I was like, I don't even know who you are anymore. I don't know what you think. I don't know what you're saying. I grew up in the church, so, I've been a Christian since I was 5 and in ministry for 24 years. So I just was taught to just sit back and watch. And then it's going to become, time reveals everything, I think MacArthur says. And so, I just sit back and watch. And as I've sat back and watched, I'm just like, I don't know who you are. I don't know what you stand for. I don't know what you're talking about anymore. So we don't really have anything, I guess, to talk about. And that's a sad, that happens in life, where you lose friends or whatever. And, but that's kind of what you've seen with, I think Rick Warren has been on the slide for a long time. Russell Moore, like you mentioned, nobody recognizes him anymore. He was at a Enneagram conference with the pastors, I think it's the Pastors and Theologians, or Pastor Theologian Conference. and I think it was last year. And I just sat and I was like, Kevin Van Hooser was there, Russell Moore was there, and you had some of these other people that everybody knows that are there promoting these kind of ideas and things. And you just sit back and you're just, I'm just shocked and disappointed. And, at a certain point, you're just like with most people, you just tune them out. And that's kind of what I've done is, but Rick Warren, like you mentioned, he has a significant influence, and we've seen how he's used, that influence. I can say when, in the early 2000s, I read his book. One of my family members was in a church heavily influenced by that. So I had all the materials, and I think I still might. We're talking the purpose-driven church, purpose-driven life. We're talking the small group materials. I've seen it all. I've seen what it does in a church when it's actually implemented, and the kind of things that it produces in the disciples in that church. And it's not a good thing. I mean, it's just
and doctrinally, we've seen his shift there. We have seen him now, I have to say pretty arrogantly, try to move the entire Southern Baptist Convention to say, not only am I departing from reserving the pastorate for men, and by the way, that is also connected to this slide because it's the same hermeneutic in allowing same-sex relationships and things. I mean, it's the exact same issue. That he so publicly did that. So it's not just a question of, I just feel different or he just sounds different. I mean, you can see it in the shift in doctrinal positions. And I do think that's important to note, is that suddenly they say, well, I've really been rethinking where I stood on that issue. And it's the same thing that you heard Andy Stanley saying about, I've really been rethinking where I stand on some of these issues of sex and sexuality. And so, I think there's a reason that 2 Peter and Jude kind of hold those particular issues out as the really big red flags to be on the lookout for, because I just think it's so obvious that they are the kind of the bellwethers that show that there's a departure from sound doctrine. So when I see that with Rick Warren and I look back at the seeker-sensitive movement, it does make it, and I was not as discerning back then. I mean, I didn't become a Christian until my early 20s. But when I look back at that period now of the seeker-sensitive movement, it seems so odd to me that we as Christians didn't even then go, well, is that what the church is supposed to do, is be very sensitive to the non-Christians who are coming among us and in our midst during our worship services? Or our worship services supposed to be about feeding and equipping the sheep? Of course, we want to welcome lost sinners, but what is the purpose of our corporate gathering? Is it just to attract the world? And it's so odd to me now to think that we never interrogated that idea much then. And one of the positive things is, I think now most people would go, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we know, kind of switching gears a little bit here, we know that abortion in the 2024 GOP platform, it's a big one, right, for voters. I've watched, as everybody has, about the debate between Biden and Trump. Everybody has their remarks and thoughts about that. But I've watched, Trump's remarks on abortion. We also know that abortion is one of the most important issues in among evangelicals, and one of the key reasons evangelicals have stuck by Trump is he delivered on his promise to overturn Roe. And so given Trump's position on abortion, do you see this as causing a serious rift among evangelicals, and if so, why? And follow-up question, how should Christians think and respond to this matter? Just the little questions. Yeah, just a
little question. But you're talking about in this upcoming election.
Yes.
So it's so funny because I was just at the RNC convention covering it for Daily Wire, and just so incredibly grieved that the GOP has decided to. Now, to be fair, I did talk to some Capitol Hill staffers who are arguing with me and saying we did not take the pro-life plank out of the platform, but they did, and softening the language on marriage. All of that is so incredibly disappointing and grievous to me. But one of the things that I think we have to recognize as evangelicals is that we have been here before. If you will remember, prior to the Reagan administration, the Republican Party didn't particularly want social conservatives then either. And I remember so distinctly hearing Rush Limbaugh on a number of occasions referencing a party he had at his house when some big donors got a hold of him and said, "What can we do to get these pro-lifers out of our party?" And Rush, in telling this story, said he was very angry about this because they were so stupid that they didn't realize those pro-lifers are the heart of your party and you shouldn't be trying to get rid of them. Those are the passionate people who really drive elections. And so when I look at that history, I go, we're just there again. I think that the pro-life movement, that evangelicals generally, were not quite prepared for what happened with that Dobbs decision overturning Roe. And I think we were not quite prepared for how much secular America loves death. And they do. They love death. They love convenience. They want to not have the responsibility of having a baby if they have sex outside of marriage. So I think that that is the first thing, is that this is all very, very new. And everybody needs to calm down for a minute and get their bearings and realize that politics are transactional. Politics is not the church. And so we, as the pro-life constituency, our job now, just as it was pre-Reagan, is to make it very clear to the Republican Party that we are going to demand recognition for an issue that for us is not merely political. This is a moral issue, it's a biblical issue, and we're going to continue fighting for it, because no government that isn't protecting the life of every citizen, including the unborn, can claim to be legitimate or just. So we're going to keep arguing for that. But at the same time, as I just heard a friend of mine say, what you can't do is take your ball and go home, because that politics is not idealism. Politics is the art of the possible. And so what we have to continue to do is steward our votes and the system that God has blessed us with, which is a representative republic where we get a say in our government. And part of that say is using our votes as wisely and as responsibly as possible. And I would say in that case, you don't bury your talent and you don't bury this vote that you have been given in the ground and wash your hands of the whole messy deal, because that doesn't do any good for the body politic and the city that you live in and the nation that you live in. So there's my big spiel that I'm incredibly disappointed, but I hope all the other evangelicals join me in fighting, because I've been in a lot of Capitol Hill staffers' ears, and as is my wont, I've also been pretty loud on Twitter and other social media platforms that, hey, this is not okay, and we're going to keep fighting for this.
You loud? No way.
I know.
No way. Make it stop. No, I totally.
Very shy, retiring Violet.
Right. No, yeah. No, I 100% agree with you. When I heard that, it just kind of smacked me over the face that I'm back in 2003, sitting in a moral philosophy class in Seattle, in the Seattle area where I grew up and lived, and I'm just sitting there listening to Trump, and I'm like, what in the heck am I listening to? My very liberal moral philosophy professor, who when I uttered even one thing under my breath, he came and said to me, if you say anything like that ever again, I still to this day, by the way, remember what I said that so offended him, but I knew in that class, if I said anything, and all those students were like, can you say something, because they all knew that that I was a Christian leader, and they were looking at me to say something. But I knew if I said something that I was probably getting kicked out of there. And so I even uttered something under my breath. But so as I sat there watching that whole entire debate, I was just so disappointed. And the more that I've, thought about that, I'm just so disappointed by what Trump said, and then even further, we've seen them go and support the LGBTQ T plus whatever it is now, whatever right. Other word is added to that TI.
I quit at the Q. I was like, that's it, no more.
Yeah,
stopping
exactly.
At Q.
Yeah, stop with the more letters. No more letters, please. Right. Stop, please. I can't keep up. Okay, just make it stop. Stop with the crazy. Anyways, but yeah, no, I just can't believe it. And I'm right there with you. We have to keep speaking up, and we have to be unafraid to say the things that that really truly do matter. We have to stand up for, Psalm 139. God makes babies in the womb, and they're made by God. They're fashioned in the womb. And so we have to be saying that to this culture of death. God says very clearly in the Ten Commandments that you shall not murder. The word murder, it actually means it's the Hebrew word watash. It means slayer, intentional. And so you can't get much more clear about the idea that God hates murder. And what is an abortion? It's intentional slaying of, an innocent child made in the womb. So, I mean, as a Christian, you can't get more clear about that, the fact that God hates abortion and God hates murder, all murder, not just, the baby, but all murder. And so, yeah, it's just maddening to me.
And one of the things that, as we look at how things have shaken out since that Dobbs decision, I do think it's worth pointing out that a lot of evangelical culture, well, I'll say elite evangelical culture, lost the courage of its convictions on the pro-life issue. And I do talk about this a little bit in the book, that suddenly you saw them throwing all kinds of things into the pro-life basket that were not traditionally understood as pro-life. Pro-life means something. It means protecting the lives of babies in the womb. And suddenly we were told, well, womb to tomb. So pro-life also means it became part of the racial grievance discussion. It became part of social justice. So it was, well, if we're going to be pro-life, then we have to back a social safety net that includes greater welfare entitlements. It even became things like you have to wear a mask if you're going to be pro-life. You have to get vaccinated if you're going to be pro-life. So suddenly we very much diluted what the term pro-life meant. So it's not that surprising that your political representation saw that to a certain degree. And I don't know how much that might have impacted the conversations being had around the campaign as people are discussing it. But it certainly seemed that we were in some ways not as committed to that issue as we seemed, because suddenly we were willing to make it about a whole host of, you even saw the Christian environmentalists saying that backing climate change legislation was pro-life. So really diluting that term, that was a part of the problem, I do believe.
I think one other thing in addition to add to that is we've seen the pro-life, supposedly pro-life movement, and it's I don't think that we've done and been clear enough, that we're against what we're against, but also what we're for, meaning we should not only be speaking up against it, but we should care about what happens legislatively. And I don't think that as Christians, we've been as clear about that. And just over the decades, and since I've been an adult, I haven't seen us be as clear on that particular point. And I think that I see a lot of other people that are becoming more clear on that. And I think that we just have to be clear about this, because like you mentioned, we live in this culture of death. And so we should care not just about speaking up morally and ethically and obviously biblically, as we have been for a long time, but we should care about seeing it end, legislatively. And I know that there's a huge debate about that, but I think if you're going to speak about one, you got to care about the other. And I think we have to work to that end as well. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree. And I think part of that, it's funny, I've been exploring the abolitionist idea, and I think at first my default too was to go, well, I'm an incrementalist, which I think I still am in strategy, in terms of let's get all the wins that we can politically, because I do believe it's transactional. But I also think that perhaps the pro-life movement has done itself a disservice in not being honest about the moral responsibility on all sides of the choice to end a baby's life. And that, when you look at countries like the UK, there is a point at which the mother faces legal ramifications for having an abortion past a certain point. And morally, that's logical. I think any adult woman instinctively knows that the vast, vast majority of women who get abortions understand what they're doing. They understand that they are ending the life of a baby in their womb. They know that. And so to continue to sort of do this messaging where we're pretending like women are not also morally culpable for that choice, I think it's discrediting. Even if we don't like self-consciously recognize that it's discrediting, on some level, the culture realizes that we're not being entirely honest about what we're talking about if we're saying only the doctors who perform this procedure are morally culpable.
That's really good. From your experience working as a cultural warrior at World Magazine and now at the Daily Wire, can you share how these jobs have shaped your perspective on issues related to religion and society that you discuss in your new book?
Wow, that is a big question. I need to think about how it shapes my thinking. I mean, I think part of it shapes my thinking because I'm immersed in it so often, not just in my personal life. Our family, pretty much our whole life revolves around the church in one way or another, whether it's our kids and their schooling, our church life in terms of our local congregation. Up until a couple of years ago, I worked in Christian media, and even still, apparently I just can't quit it, because even when I go to a secular media company, I still want to write about those issues. So in so many ways, I think on the one hand, you would think I might get a little cynical since I cover some things that are in some ways discouraging when you see compromise in the church and you see some nefarious actors trying to use it for worldly purposes. But I don't think that's really been my reaction, because I see so well the promise lived out that Christ is building his church and the gates of hell are not going to prevail against it. And I see again and again all of the work on the ground that Christians are doing. And there's this sense that however much it feels when you look at the big picture, like, oh, Christians aren't discerning or we're missing these things. When you talk to people one-on-one, when you're interviewing people or you're having interviews like you and I are right now, you find out, oh, that's not the case. There are many, many, many people in this country that the Lord has reserved for himself. And that's part of the encouragement of my job, is that I get to talk to them all the time. And, so that's uplifting to me to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's uplifting to me too, to be able to see in people who aren't willing to bow the knee to Baal and compromise and stand on the word. It's these conversations are important to have, and they're really encouraging. So that's why I said at the beginning, my wife and I, we and so many others appreciate your boldness and your faithfulness, and your unflinching desire to honor God is absolutely commendable, and in the face of all that you see, and so praise the Lord for that, right?
Absolutely. And the other thing too is I do enjoy kind of diving into the history, because then we remember, oh, this isn't new. Every era of church life, they've had to deal with people who wanted to use the church for aims that God did not create it for. And every era has had compromise, and every era has had heresy. So we deal with error and heresy all the time. And the church continues to build and grow and thrive.
Amen. Amen. Well, looking ahead, what are some emerging cultural issues that you think will shape discourse in the near future?
In terms of evangelicals?
Yes.
Well, one, I think we're seeing, and this is a good thing, though I'm still thinking my way through it myself, because I don't have the educational background to know what I think of some of the church fathers and what they wrote about how Christians are to engage with the civic sphere. But suddenly there's this sort of renaissance of young writers and thinkers interrogating the idea of Christians separating themselves in the sense of, this is my church life, and this is my political life, and this is my public life. And I think suddenly this renewed Kuyperian interest in how do we fully live out our Christianity in every aspect of our lives without cloistering any of it. And in some ways it's a debate, and I think that's a good thing, that, you have some people who are very concerned, is this Christian nationalism? And I don't know what I think about some of those ideas, but I do know that I like people having the conversation of, okay, what is God's will for how we shape our nation, our communities. So I'm not sure how it will unfold at this point, but I know that I really like hearing those conversations and learning alongside of a lot of other people who are like me, not intellectuals by any stretch of the imagination. So we're kind of rediscovering these older, whether they're Puritan texts or Calvin's texts or all of these ideas about, okay, what does this mean to us in the 21st century? And what did we lose over the years when we just kind of defaulted into this, very sort of comfortable mid-century idea of what American Christianity is?
I think that's a good thing, and I like Kuiper. I like his ideas, and that there's not one square inch where God doesn't say mine, mine, and that idea of him not only being a pastor but interested in politics because he was interested in people, right, and the glory of God, and I think that we have to have open and honest like you're advocating for, open and honest dialogue, and we as Christians have done that. You mentioned Calvin. Calvin was writing thousands of letters all over the world, to various pastors and peoples. That's what he could do in his day. If he had Zoom and what we have today, he might have been using Zoom and doing that. Right. Then we wouldn't have had the rich resources of his letters and his thought, and and on and on. And so I think that we as Christians should, just saying it out loud, we shouldn't be afraid to have the conversations, even if they're uncomfortable. And we shouldn't get, here's what I'll say, we shouldn't get offended if people disagree with us, because they're allowed to disagree with us, and the issue is if we're going to be disagreeable. And I think that a lot of people on a certain side are unfortunately disagreeable. Not going to mention names on that, so and I'm not going to tell you who I think that is, but I'm just saying all you have to do is go online. You can see who's disagreeable and who's agreeable. But I think that we should be willing, and I've said this for a long time. I wish that people that had issues would get off Twitter and Facebook and all of this, get on a Zoom call, have that conversation. Hey, here's an even wilder idea. Publish that conversation, that private conversation that you had, so that other people can see it.
Yes, for people like me who are going, I'm still sifting this and trying to figure out what I think of some of these things. So I find those debates really beneficial.
Yeah, and nobody has to get offended or upset. Just present your case and leave it at that. And if you disagree, great. If you learn something, say, hey, I appreciate you sharing that perspective. And yeah, that can go a long way to help a lot of these conversations. But anyway, I'm getting on a rabbit trail here. Sorry about that. Can you just as we're getting close to wrapping up, can you tell our listeners and those who watch this show where they can find out more about you and your work?
Sure. So you can find me at Daily Wire. I do a lot of publishing there, and of course, I work for them. I'm on Morning Wire several times a week. Which, if you're not familiar, it's we have a lot of popular opinion podcasts at Daily Wire, but we also have a Just News, 15 minutes in and out morning podcast every day. And so Morning Wire is the show that I'm on several days a week. So I would recommend finding me there. It's very similar to a lot of the work I did at World as well, where I cover cultural topics. And you can always find me on Twitter, or X as it's called now. I'm at Meg Basham. And on Instagram at journalist Megan Basham. So yeah, just kind of all the usual social media haunts. And I post a lot. When I write for other outlets, I typically post it there, so you can see that as well.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, just as we wrap up today's episode, can you give us a few takeaways, Megan?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway while working on my book is, one, that we need to acknowledge that worldly influences, secular influences have an interest in moving the church, especially in a nation that still has as significant a percentage of the population that claims Christianity as ours does, and unfortunately is in many ways very illiterate on what sound doctrine is, as ours is. So that makes us pretty easy targets. So for that reason, I think, one, we need to be equipping ourselves. We need to know our Bible. We need to know what sound doctrine is, so that when it's coming into the church and those little alarm bells are going off, we know, okay, is this justified or is this not justified? Because we're so saturated in the word that it's very easy to recognize the counterfeits when they come in. So that's one. And then another big takeaway for me has been, we need to acknowledge that these things are happening, that these secular left influences are capturing ministries and they are using them to create AstroTurf campaigns to move evangelicals, and that not every single person who gets caught up in that is necessarily a wolf or something like that. And part of the way that we confront that is, let's begin by having charitable, respectful conversations about it. And if the pattern of lack of discernment goes on, then those conversations, I think, can get a little bit tougher. And I think at that point, we could say, maybe some people have forfeited their right to leadership because they have consistently shown a lack of discernment with these things. But we start by having the conversations and not ignoring it, because I think for a long time, there was a sense of that being kind means ignoring it. And I don't think those are the same thing. And then, along with that, I would just say when it is clear that you're dealing with a ministry or a well-known pastor or church leader who is not stewarding his authority well and is using it for unbiblical reasons and for worldly influences, at that point, I think it's important for us to go, let's stop giving our money and attention to those people. Because unfortunately, there are still a lot of people trying to make a lot of money off of building these enormous ministries and huge mega churches. And it's not hard, I don't think, to build those by not offending the world and, preaching prosperity gospels and those kind of things that people want to hear that stuff. So part of the way we can, make that less attractive is let's not add to the attention and revenues that they're getting.
Amen. I 100% agree. I wish we would not. I wish we would stop talking about platforming this and that too, just to add to that.
I do hate that word. Yeah.
I do. It's just like there's nothing wrong with having reaching people and being faithful to the word and having a desire to see whatever you're doing be used and be helpful to people, but. Yeah, I mean, you could get me on a long, and I mean, we don't even, we don't have enough time to talk about that.
That's a sequel episode.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, maybe, but but it's been so good to talk with you, Megan, today. The book is Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. If you're watching the video, I didn't show it. Here it is. Check that out. Check out Megan's work at Daily Wire. Check out the Morning Wire. I'm going to check that out. So I'll be listening. Keep doing good work there. That's an encouragement, not I'm going to listen. And so you better say good things. That's not what I meant. Might be construed that way. I didn't mean it that way. But anyway, thank you so much, Megan.
Thanks for having me, Dave. This has been great.
Yeah, it has.
Thank you for listening to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, rate us on the app, and share this with your friends and family on social media. If you want to find us on social media, you can find us on Twitter @Servants of Grace, on Instagram @Servants of Grace, or by searching @Servants of Grace on Facebook. You can also find this episode and many others like it on the front page of our website, servantsofgrace.org.